to Wellbeing and Heritage, Developing Strategies and Delivering Impact with Linda Monkton from Historic England. I'm Lorraine O'Donnell, Research Associate with the Quebec English-Speaking Communities Research Network, known as QuestGren. I acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the places from which we are attending today's event. It is taking place live at Concordia University in Montreal on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of these lands and waters. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Today's topic of links between heritage and well-being is one that Indigenous communities have addressed. It would be great if someone with knowledge of Indigenous approaches to this topic is present in our audience today and could speak to the issue during the Q&A period. The event is part of QuestGren's Lunch and Learn series, now over 2 years old, initiated under COVID, may I add. We are happy to have a new event partner, the Laboratoire d'Histoire et de Patrimoine de Montréal, LHPM, at Université de Québec à Montréal. Also new, this is a hybrid event, live streamed from Concordia's Loyola campus. In the room are representatives of QuestGren and LHPM's partner groups. Among our guests online and in person are representatives of the Department of Canadian Heritage, including Sarah Boily, Anne Calderon-Gutierrez, and Nawal Ben-Zaid, as well as from the Secrétariat aux Relations avec les Québécois d'expression anglaise, online, Julia Sotuzek and Lynn Hamill. The Secrétariat Canadian Heritage and the Fonds de Recherche du Québec, Société et Culture, support QuestGren and LHPM. Joanne Burgess, Professor of History at the Université du Québec à Montréal and Director of LHPM, will now speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. Merci, Lorraine. Comme Lorraine vient de l'expliquer, mon nom est Joanne Burgess. Je suis professeure au département d'histoire de l'Université du Québec à Montréal et la directrice du laboratoire d'histoire et de patrimoine de Montréal de l'UQAM. Le laboratoire est une équipe de recherche en partenariat financée par le Fonds québécois de recherche, culture et société, qui réunit des chercheurs universitaires et un grand nombre de partenaires du milieu montréalais, québécois et canadien qui s'intéressent à l'histoire et au patrimoine, à la recherche, à la connaissance et à la mise en valeur. Nous sommes vraiment extrêmement heureux d'être associés à cet événement qui s'inscrit pour notre part dans notre série de conférences Midi du laboratoire. La présentation aura lieu en anglais, mais pendant la période de questions, vous pouvez inscrire vos questions en français dans le chat. Il me fera plaisir de traduire les questions pour que Mme Monkton puisse y répondre. La thématique de cette présentation nous touche particulièrement puisque le laboratoire et ses membres sont très soucieux des questions, des thématiques qui touchent à la relation entre la communauté, les communautés et le patrimoine. Et donc, cette question du bien-être dans toutes ces manifestations est une question qui nous touche. Donc, je vous souhaite une belle présentation.
It's my pleasure, my great pleasure, to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Linda Monkton, visiting us from England. Linda is an architectural historian with a special interest in the social impact of the historic environment. She has been working in the heritage profession for over 25 years as a researcher, analyst, and strategist. Linda leads Historic England's approach to delivering health and well-being outcomes. And she is the author of its first well-being and heritage strategy. Linda, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Lorraine. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I just wanted to say a couple of things before we start. So I just wanted to reiterate Lorraine's land acknowledgement. It's a real privilege for me to be here today, and also to thank the Laboratoire and Questgren for their support in allowing me to be here in person, which is really genuinely a joy. And my first visit to Montreal, so it's a joy in many, many respects. I have so many things that I could say today. I kind of had about 50 slides when I started this presentation, and then I kind of thought I'm never going to get through that in 20 minutes. So there's quite a few words on some of the slides, but for both English and French speakers, the slides will be available in English and French afterwards. So if you feel that you've missed something because I've kind of whooshed past, please don't worry, there's an opportunity to have a look at them afterwards. And of course, there's also questions. So I will crack on. Somebody asked me, in fact, Elaine asked me yesterday why I had got into wellbeing and heritage. And I realized that I answered in a very organizational way, like why my organization had created the space for wellbeing to happen. So my organization, Historic England, is the government's advisor on the historic environment in England. So we're directly funded by the UK government, but our territory is English. There are comparable organisations in the other devolved nations of Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. But the part of the question I didn't give to Elaine last night was actually my own reasons for being involved in wellbeing and heritage, which is this issue about social justice. So I think many of us feel instinctively that heritage has potential. You know, people enjoy engaging with it. There are loads of positives. It stimulates ideas, memory, creativity. But for me, there's a fundamental issue about how we can use that to help think about addressing inequalities in society rather than just as an enjoyable extra. This is something which is core to our very being. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Sustainable Development Goals embed these principles into structures. And I just think it's a really good place to start to remind ourselves that this is something which has been culturally acknowledged on a kind of global scale, and that we should really take heart from this and utilize the power of heritage as much as we can. When we talk in England, in the UK context about well-being, I'm going to come on to what it means a little bit more later on, but I'm really talking about a way to think about social impact. And we have talked about social impact and heritage, I think, for many years, but I don't think, if I'm honest, we've been very good at intentionally delivering it. We're happy when there are almost accidental, serendipitous benefits to the work that we've engaged with. You know, a high street regeneration program makes everyone feel happier to go into the town, or a particular project. But I feel one of the driving forces behind the wellbeing and heritage strategy is really this idea about working with intentionality. And so I just put up this slide to really remind myself and others that what I'm talking about is health and well-being as one way of considering the social impact of our work. And the little diagram, the sort of cup on the right, is not a heritage diagram, but when one is thinking about social impact, these are the sorts of categories that non-heritage people might say one might measure social impact of a project in much the same way as one might have a few years ago done an environmental impact assessment before a project starts. But I also wanted to just flag up some work that's happened through the European Union, and I was involved in this only at the end. So the core element of this is a European funded project, SOPHIA, the Social Platform for Holistic Heritage Impact Assessment. There's a lot of detail on this slide. So I think all I really wanted to do was flag up that there's been this process in Europe with the European Union where they've been thinking, what are the domains, what are the categories of impact that we think heritage kind of plays upon? And then on the right, that kind of circle of these 6 domains, you will see it has identity of place, quality of life, protection of the historic environment, etc. But under identity of place, it talks about aesthetics, it talks about identity, memory, visibility, reputation, heritage-led regeneration. But then under quality of life, it talks about living conditions and peace and safety. And for me, all of these things play into this idea about the value of heritage. Now, no one framework will work for everybody, but I thought this might be useful for people to maybe look at afterwards and just reflect on whether it's useful for the way that they work within heritage. And there's a whole website that is quite easy to use actually through this project. So just to speak a little bit about what happens in the UK, and I'm aware and very conscious that I have not represented Northern Ireland on this. Northern Ireland, the Department of Communities is held within government and has a slightly different structure. We're outside government, but an agency of government. So in England, I would say that there are lots of ways in which the concept of well-being is flagged as important, but not clearly articulated. So we have a culture white paper from 2010. It mentions well-being 22 times in terms of the value of culture, but it doesn't really articulate what that looks like. We also currently have a bill going through our parliament called Levelling Up and Regeneration. And in it, it is likely to have a number of missions associated with the bill. And I've just put 3 of them on the screen here as they best refer to heritage, which is pride of place, well-being and health. So I think there's lots of opportunity for us to structurally build heritage and well-being into our work. But I actually wanted to really herald the work in Scotland and Wales as perhaps being more relevant to this context. So Scotland is, well, a little bit like I think some of the work in Canada, but certainly Iceland, Finland, New Zealand and Scotland have all worked quite hard on developing a well-being economy, where they're trying to represent the prosperity of their nation through health and well-being and social capital, rather than just gross domestic product. So the kind of the flower on the right, the sort of Scottish wheel, explains the purpose being about well-being and economic growth. And you will see that they have identified various ways to do with community that they feel that that's relevant. The Welsh example, I think, is really interesting. So in Wales, Wales has its own parliament, as I'm sure you know, but it's created the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, which is an act which puts a duty on all public bodies to report the wellbeing impact of what they do. Now, we have a public framework, a public value framework in England, which encourages that, but it's not quite the same as having it written into legislation. So there's a huge benefit, I think, in moving forward to having that structurally embedded wellbeing approach. And they're still working out exactly what it looks like. It's only been enacted for a few years. But one of the things in Wales, as you'll see from this, is this issue about language. That the resurgence of Welsh language has been through really conscious effort on the part of the Welsh over the past 10 to 20 years, and that this is also embedded into their approach. And it just occurred to me that might feel relevant to the current context. Oh, I don't know what that's doing. Oh, yes, I do. So when I'm talking about well-being from historic England's point of view, there are many, many definitions. And at one point, when I had my 50 slides that I wanted to share with you, there were many definitions of well-being on them. But for these purposes, we've identified 2 aspects of well-being to think about with our work. This model on the screen was created by an organization called the New Economics Foundation. And the idea is it gives you the characteristics that an individual might usefully have to produce individual well-being. So this really falls into this idea of subjective well-being. How do I feel in myself? What is my life satisfaction? And as you can see, this is about personal qualities and how one responds to one's environment around you. And they also refer to of social well-being, the social connection and the significance of that to people's individual well-being. But there's another element, which are the social determinants of health and well-being, which is a historic environment body, I think are really relevant. So it's not just about big issues like climate change, but for us as a historic environment agency, it's also about the quality of that built environment. Is it a neglected place? Does it have qualities that make you feel safe? Is it tranquil? Is it noisy? There's all sorts of characteristics. And you'll see from this diagram this is a old but still often used articulation of this, the sorts of social determinants of health. So what does this look like for heritage? So this is from a 2018 document, which was our first published document on well-being through Historic England. And I suggest here, I mean, these things are all, you know, they can all be changed over time. But at the time of doing this review, it felt like there were 6 routes where heritage created well-being, like 6 mechanisms. And again, that they're all in the report, but this idea that it's a process, that you as a person go through a process, and this is most often represented through volunteering, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But it could be visiting a site. It could be that participation of visiting. It could be simply the heritage is the mechanism for sharing something. There are some more therapeutic objectives, and I'm going to come to some of those. And there are some quite place-based ones that I'm going to come to as well. I'm just going to whiz through this. This is simply a slide which summarizes the objectives of our strategy. Our strategy, or no strategy, should be rocket science. And this simply says we should embed wellbeing outcomes in what we do intentionally, and that to do that, we support our staff. And through doing both of those things, we can help elicit the potential of heritage more widely. And we're categorizing this as 4 priority areas of trying to report on what can heritage deliver for mental health, loneliness, young people and older people. These are not mutually exclusive, obviously. But what I would like us to see, what I would like to see us do is to work with this intention of, are we working with thriving populations at a population or community level, or are we actually working with individuals who are struggling, where we would take a more needs-based assessment or a more trauma-informed way of working, rather than delivering something and expecting people to come. So inevitably, I'm got too much to say, so I'm going to just whiz through 3 case studies. HAR in English speak for Historic England means heritage at risk. So this is a heritage at risk and wellbeing research. We looked at 10 sites that had been part of our heritage at risk programme, where we will help support communities, often through volunteering, to bring things back to life or repair them to a condition. And the reason I thought this was interesting here is because the research identified, by retrospectively evaluating their impact on the communities that were involved, this idea of what the kinds of wellbeing outcomes were for the participants. And you can see here purpose, being, capacity, sharing, self-nurture and self-actualization. And again, the whole report is online, so you can catch up with all of this. Many of the terms that came out of the work actually really closely link with this idea of the New Economics Foundation characteristics. So we know what works for wellbeing. We can identify that heritage gives us that. And then our job, it seems to me, is connecting the two in the middle and intentionally making sure that we're doing it. I think what was particularly interesting about this project is that there were specific bits of wellbeing that related to the heritageness, the heritage qualities of the project. And there were also particular benefits for the fact that they were working with something that needed help and the at-risk status of the monument. So this idea of legacy and transformation came through really powerfully. And in some other little research we've done, that's also come up as being really important for people's well-being and feeling that they're contributing towards something in the future. And I just show here a couple of quotes from the project. I can't say it's my heritage because I wasn't born here, but I suppose, you know, it's become my place. And I think these qualitative things give us an indication of the value that people associate with the work. One of the place-based projects that we've been involved in is in Kirkham, which is a socially and economically deprived part of Lancashire in the northwest of England. And we're investing as an organisation a lot of money in heritage regeneration. But there's a community consortium and cultural activity that goes with that programme, that funded programme. But in Kirkham, they've chosen to exclusively link that to health and wellbeing. So whilst there may be particular events, they're also converting this building into a kind of community health and wellbeing hub, where it will have a direct link to the local health service. He will be able to refer people who are perhaps lonely or have mental health needs to connect up with the cultural offer. And this was simply a diagram that explained this idea that I referred to earlier in our strategy, that you can have street and public activities for those who are thriving, that you can have perhaps partnership work for those who are striving, but there may be some bespoke healthcare solutions for those who are struggling more and who have particular needs. The third project is a project called Rejuvenate, which is very close to my heart. We've been working on it for 2 to 3 years. The blue line is kind of where we are now, if you like. So we've done some feasibility and development work, and literally when I get back next week, we will start the 2 pilot projects. And these 2 pilot projects will look at working with young people in the school system who are vulnerable, and it will look at working with young people who have already entered the criminal justice system. And using heritage interventions, the idea is that we will use some of our learning to see if we can build their self-determination. And we will record and evaluate that. So it's got a mixture of heritage, the outdoor environmental, the wildlife, the cultural landscape recognition. There'll be some actual archaeology. And in this development stage, there was creative practice and there was building of a homestead. So this idea of using ideas from prehistoric archaeology to reconstruct some heritage. So it brings together lots of areas, really. And this particular project, the development stage was very short, but they did do a series of evaluations to see how it impacted on the young people. And over time, there was an increased recognition of the value that it gave them, their experience of the archaeology, and how valued they felt by the project. I probably don't really have time to go into this. And every time I look at this, I feel that it's wrong. And maybe this is something we will discuss in the questions. But it's, if we were to define what's the USP, what's the unique selling point of heritage in terms of well-being, there are many ways in which I think heritage brings together a lot of characteristics that can contribute towards well-being, which might be found in part in other places. But I think by working with heritage, we can bring them together. And so I'll stop there. This is just a slide for people to use afterwards with some pointers to further resources. Like I say, there's millions of thoughts in my head of things that we could also discuss, but I hope that's at least touching a few points of interest for people both in the room and online. So thank you very much.
I'm very pleased that Alain Roy will now provide comments on the presentation. Alain is Senior Policy Advisor at Library and Archives Canada and researcher at the Laboratoire. He will help us think through implications of Linda's research for the Canadian context. Here, the vitality concept is used in research, policy, and law in relation to Canada's official language minority communities. Alain has conducted groundbreaking research on links between heritage and official language minority community vitality. Alain?
Merci Lorraine et bonjour Linda, bienvenue au Québec. My comment will be in English so, to spark the discussion. First of all, thanks for your presentation, which is like rich and just launching the conversation. And also I want to thank you for all the work done by Historic England on this important issue of well-being and heritage, an issue that is of great importance in our post-pandemic world, because this question was raised a lot of places. And I can't account in a few minutes, I have only 5 minutes, for all the work done, and your presentation is so rich, but let me point out 2 issues and questions of interest. First, I want to underline the overall assumption on which the research and the strategy are based, which is that heritage has the power to improve people's life. This is the main point. And this is important because it's not only about the past, it's about, in fact, the present and the future of the communities. And how does heritage do this? It does this by bringing communities together by reinforcing their sense of belonging and connection, by supporting their identity and confidence. It links, so your report links heritage and historic environment with the social fabrics of the community and its well-being. The second point I want to focus, and it's from the strategy, you mentioned it rapidly in your presentation, about there are 3 levels of individual needs, defined as thriving, surviving, and struggling. The response you propose is respectively support, build capacity, and address inequity. But it's not only about individual needs, but when we think about minority communities, this is exactly the needs they are. This corresponds in fact to their needs too. So there's some idea that I will continue. But what could the possible implications of this research in Canadian WellMC? This is what I've been tasked to. And to launch the discussion, I would suggest 3 proposals. First, heritage and memory are essential parts of the well-being and vitality of communities. As you may know, Canada, as part of its core identity, has 2 official languages and communities, French and English. And in the 80s, the official language was modified to ensure that federal institutions support their vitality and development, a section which is currently under revision as the Act 2. For years, studies and reports have been produced on the concept of vitality in support of public action. Many aspects were considered, moving from ethno-linguistic approach to institutional completedness or other dimensions, but bizarrely, heritage and memory factor was ignored. As memory institution, Library and Archives Canada has the mandate under the Official Language Act to support WellMC's vitality. But as memory institution, how can we do that? So it was by considering how memories support their vitality. It is so because memory affirms in the inscription of a community in a perspective of duration, is part of the social bond and asserts itself as distinct. In a minority setting, it is even more important to recognize this importance. It was the cornerstone of my report, published in 2021, but still now, I can say that the issue is fully recognized. The Historic England work on well-being and heritage support this public discussion on value of heritage. But the question remains how to make sure that all components of a society, including governments, acknowledge it. For sure, the call is on us, is on all of us. Second, an ecosystem approach is required to apprehend heritage, memory, and their social value. To understand the impact of heritage on well-being, many factors are considered. In fact, only through an ecosystem perspective could we assess it correctly, and your presentation clearly demonstrates that. But heritage itself is part of a larger memory ecosystem that encompasses all reminders of the community's past in the present. In that perspective, not only heritage, but other manifestations of the past, historical research and publications, commemorations, etc., contribute to the collective memory of the group. Therefore, vitality of memory is the strength and diversity with which a community memory is expressed, which will support the community's well-being. Then we have to consider this as a global approach. And third point, level of needs can guide heritage and memory organization. As food for thought, how can the needs for well-being as defined, could apply to official language minority communities? For sure, it's correspond, in fact, to the situation of those minorities. They are thriving, they are struggling, and they are surviving too. So so often at the same time. But in fact, the way it is thought about the way Historic England should answer to that could be also applied and used as a guide for support WellMC's organization. So That's it. Thank you.
Merci, Alain. Thank you, Alain. I don't know if Linda wanted to respond to some of that later on. So we're now open for questions and comments, monitoring the chat and also people in the room. I don't see very much in the chat. We're all perhaps overwhelmed by the richness or the wealth of information. Certainly, if there are comments or questions, I would welcome them. Perhaps until they appear in my chat. I think Lorraine had a comment, and so that could launch our discussion.
Hi, Linda. Thank you. I know your own background is in built heritage and medieval buildings in particular, but clearly you've looked at a broader range of heritage and heritage-related activities that can contribute to well-being. I wonder if you could talk to us about, in a little bit more detail, what are some of the activities and the positive outcomes, for example, around loneliness and group cohesion?
Hi. Yeah, there's lots of things I could say to that. There's been a tendency, I think, at home for the arts and cultural sector to have been working with well-being for longer than perhaps the historic environment sector. But there's a lot that we can learn through the way that museum objects and archives have been used to engage people for well-being. So I think there's kind of, as Alain has said, there's a bigger kind of ecosystem of what's going on in the heritage sector. There are some quite well-established programs and activities that have existed within the world of archaeology. So the heritage sector, well, at home, archaeology is a process, if you like, the actual physical doing of the archaeology. Archaeology is done largely at home through commercial-led archaeology, through responding to development. But addressing this issue about a more therapeutic goal, there's a program called Operation Nightingale, which has been successfully run for a few years at home, not by Historic England, by others, that works with veterans that suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And that's a really good example of something where the characteristics of the archaeology have led to an environment that really suits that group of people. So it's team building, it's hierarchical, it's for a common purpose, it's creative. Archaeology, I know it's destructive in one sense because you're uncovering things, but actually it's a creative process. And also it gives people the opportunity to be involved at very different levels. So you can be digging, or you can be drawing, or you can be simply recording where the finds are, or you can be doing the geophysical survey, or you can be documenting. So it provides, I think, a good example of the different, there is no one solution that fits all with any of the things that we've talked about. But I think in something like that, you get this kind of complexity within a project where different elements of the process can work really well for different kinds of needs. The only caveat I would say to that is, and this is true for Operation Nightingale, is that they would always have somebody that wasn't a heritage expert, that was a psychologist or a psychiatrist or somebody on site, because there are examples of veterans. One of the projects, Waterloo Uncovered, which is a similar example, they're actually uncovering battle sites, and there are triggers that can be sometimes positive and sometimes negative. So it's really important if you're working in the struggling category, which I would class Operation Nightingale as, because it's responding to a very particular need, that you have that support in place. And I think there's been a discussion at home about, well, we're heritage professionals, we don't know how to do that, but we should never be doing this on our own. Working with vulnerable people is not my expertise, but knowing what I could bring to people whose expertise it is, what heritage can bring to those people, I think is the role that we have of facilitating that partnership.
From Samuel Gaudreau-Lalande, what kind of methodologies are you using to measure the social impact of activities, and can they be implemented into small-scale local projects?
That's a very good question. Yes and no, I suppose, is the answer. So there was a literature review at home which looked at many heritage projects to see how well they were evaluated, and it's published by the What Works Centre for Wellbeing, and you can look it up, Heritage and Wellbeing Scoping Study. And that found that many heritage projects are not very well evaluated at all in terms of wellbeing. But I think the question for me, which I hope responds to Samuel's question, is it depends what you're trying to find out. So as a structural, strategic organization, I want to know two things, I guess. I want to know the power of heritage. So how well does it work generally? But I also want to know how I could demonstrate the collective power through all of these local projects. But to do that, you would need them all to measure everything in the same way, which is really, really difficult. At a local level, you are probably more likely to want to know what actually just works in your context. And you need different kinds of measurement and evaluation for both. So to be a bit more specific, there are some general questions that can be applied to most wellbeing projects. So in the context of the UK, the Office of National Statistics created a set of 4 questions called the ONS4, colloquially, at home, and they're about life satisfaction. And the reason for using them is because they're baselined, because the ONS validated them. They made sure that they made sense. They were answered in the right kind of way, but also because they compare to a national data set of well-being that you can look up on the Office of National Statistics website. And there are only 4 questions. There are other commonly used mental health measurement scales. So for us, one of those would be the Warwick and Edinburgh Mental Health Scale, which is 7 or 14 questions about mental health. And habitually, I would say these are really good for using with people if you want to understand their subjective well-being and their mental health. Having said that, we initiated a project in the north of England where the people that we were working with had multiple health needs, lived on their own, and were people that we'd never really engaged with before. And there is no way we could have used those sets of questions with them. It would have felt intrusive, it would have felt inappropriate, and it was way too overwhelming. And so there were really basic, literally physical boards, almost like a kind of abacus where you have like a slide and you talk through with people how they feel something has influenced them, and then you try and capture that. But for me, none of this works without qualitative, informal understanding of what makes a difference to somebody. So some of the quotes I showed you, you need as well as that formal measurement. I'm not sure whether I've quite answered it. It's a really complicated issue, actually, because I think you can do things nationally and locally. But I think locally, often that isn't what people are trying to achieve. And I don't think my job is to force them to do a set of things because it has to work for their context. But there's some frameworks and guidance that could move us perhaps in a general direction.
So if the person who asked that question has any follow-up, they can put that in the chat and then we could relay that to Linda. Would that be all right?
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
So Alain had a comment, I think, or question, and then I'll go back to the person in the chat.
Okay, my question is the following. In your report and your presentation, in fact, citizen involvement is critical to the success and well-being. And in fact, it's like, and it's more and more, a lot of things are focusing on this citizen engagement and citizen history, etc. But what was the reaction, in fact, in England about the work done in Historic England about this question of well-being? How was the report received, in fact, by the heritage sector, whether professional or association? Is there what were the follow-up done in the community for the report of the report?
Do you mean how did the communities respond, or how did we respond as a heritage sector?
how they saw this report and how they react to the report? Or is there any public discussions? I mean, you know.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. There's it's kind of expanding. So I think we did our report in 2018 and we didn't make a huge fuss about it. You know, there was no kind of balloons or anything, you know, it was just popped up there and, you know, I probably put out a tweet or something. And that was a kind of like, I think to see how it landed, I was really struck by how many people got in touch actually and said, oh my goodness, somebody's writing about wellbeing and heritage, Lorraine amongst them, but others as well. And I think it's become something which a lot of heritage bodies realise that they need to understand in order for themselves to be resilient organisations, that in 20 years' time, you won't be able to not report on the social impact of your work, or arguably in 5 years' time. So there's an organisation which is a sort of, it's an umbrella body for a network of smaller heritage organisations called the Heritage Alliance. So they picked up on it and they've now created their own report on heritage and wellbeing. And I think, and what we're doing internally now is thinking about how do we help the heritage sector go through that process of understanding what works, because there's no way, as I say, no one solution fits all. So there are kind of ideas about how to deliver things, but you need to be in a project to know what works in the actual project. So we're creating, I've created 2 networks at home, one which is Heritage Sector, which is a virtual network where we meet and we have task and finish groups to try to get the sector to itself work through what it thinks good measurement might look like nationally and locally, and for it to think about how it might relate to the health sector and what the challenges are for big and small heritage organisations. And I have another one which works with the Republic of Ireland and the 4 devolved nations of the UK, which looks at policy. Mm-hmm. So how can we prove the potential of heritage? That kind of the bigger strategic question. And I think what's interesting is, again, since the strategy has been published, I've had lots of non-heritage organisations like wildlife organisations, forestry organisations come and say, we're trying to do the same thing. How did you get to that process? So there is a kind of, I don't think it's all coming from us by any stretch. The museums have been publishing on this for a while, but I do think it is gradually embedding in people's consciousness. So the challenge now is to help people see what it actually looks like in practice, and also to be realistic about what we claim in any individual project. Because anything that you do in one intervention is one tiny element in somebody's life. So I think we also need to be really careful about how we present our detailed impact on an individual that has many, many things in their life. So, you know, I'd like us to work with very significant intent, as I said, but also with very good awareness about the social context in which we're working. Mm-hmm. But it's such a big and complicated, it's sort of on one hand, it's really simple. We just know that heritage does brilliant things and we want to do more of it. But when you get down to the sort of individual level, it's just dynamic and complicated, and unpacking that, I think, is a real challenge. But we do have a lot of work. I second my senior policy officer to an organisation called the National Academy of Social Prescribing. And that's an organisation which is exclusively funded by our Department of Health. So there is also an acknowledgement within the Department of Health now that cultural activities should be used in a way to help address very specific health needs. So it's kind of, you know what I mean? It's kind of moving in strange and interesting directions.
So 2 questions. Thank you. There are 2 questions in the chat. First, I may not be pronouncing the name properly. Niam Devaney, who basically thanks you for your presentation, and asks, would it be possible to still include Northern Ireland on the slide with the note that their structure is different and provide a link? Many thanks.
Yes, it is. It is possible. It's just I would have to have a better understanding of the legislation in Northern Ireland to have done that. Whereas And the Northern Ireland situation is a department within government. So it has a slightly different relationship to government. I would also say, I mean, I can do that and I can provide a link for that. But I think the issue is also that the devolved nations are all in slightly different places. And so Historic England generously supports my post, whereas there isn't a dedicated post in Northern Ireland to consider issues about wellbeing and heritage. So we're all learning from each other. So I can absolutely provide the context for that. But yeah, we're all in different places. And as you know, Northern Ireland has struggled to maintain a governing parliament as well, which tends to hamper progress sometimes as well. So it's a very, very different environment. And much more trauma-informed issues about well-being and heritage there as well.
And memory.
Yeah, and memory.
We have another, okay, so the person thanks you for your explanation. And then there was, I guess, a follow-up, just perhaps to share with you from Monsieur Gaudreau-Lalande, who thanked you for your answer. That was about measuring, evaluation. And who says, as a representative of a small regional museum, I can only wish for a national or network organization to take on the establishment of a common framework for social impact analysis in heritage organizations, for our means to do so alone are very limited.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's good to hear, actually, that there is a role for national bodies in helping that direction. And actually, Historic England is trying to create its own social outcomes framework at the moment. And at the moment, that will be for us. But the idea is that that kind of institutional social impact framework could at least then provide some guidance to local heritage bodies. And they may choose whether to adopt it or not. But interesting that people are asking the same question here as they are at home, which is, we don't know exactly how to do it in a way that has the most impact. So that's really helpful to understand.
Then there's another question from Mehdi Gafouri. I wonder if you've considered, screen just jumped. I wonder if you've considered social development indicators formulated by the UN Commission for Social Development. I would also like to suggest there is a need for a paradigm shift for object-centered heritage conservation to human-centered, this can't be the right word. Can you make that out? I'm sorry. It says it can't be preparatory heritage development? No. It can't be preparatory heritage development. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with the word there.
I think I can try and speak to it.
Participatory.
Oh, participatory.
Thank you. Participatory. Thank you.
The answer to the first part of the question is no. So that's really quick. Not really. The answer to the second part of the question is that one of the things that I'm really pleased to see in our wellbeing and heritage strategy is exactly the words that we should move to a more human-centered approach. So this isn't just about protecting the historic environment, although that remains our core function as an organisation. It's about looking equitably at a human and a heritage-centered way of thinking about our work. So I think that relates really well to Elaine's work that he's done on vitality and memory as well, about having this human-centered approach, a kind of person and human-centered approach.
There's another question, which is in French. So I'll read it in French and then translate it, de Cassandra Smith. Merci pour la présentation. J'aimerais savoir si vous avez été en mesure d'identifier quelques qualités intrinsèques communes aux sites patrimoniaux permettant de supporter ou de faciliter le bien-être et la santé. So the question is, have you been able to identify sort of common, some intrinsic qualities that are common to different heritage sites, which I guess are better apt to support or to facilitate well-being and health?
Thank you for your question. There's been a piece of research called Places of Joy by the University of Southampton and Cambridge at Home, which did some work in the summer after lockdown. So it must have been last summer, in that kind of weird middle bit where we thought we were clear and then we weren't. And they talked to a lot of people at heritage sites and did some interviews, and their work, I think it might also be called Heritage After Lockdown, but if you Googled all of those terms, you would find it. And that came up with some ideas about the kinds of things that people found relevant in a heritage site setting. I think it raises questions about accessibility and the self-selected nature of the constituents, though. And inevitably, you're asking people that already have the agency to visit. So I think the accessibility issue is probably the crucial one in the context of that question. It's how do you make this something which more people feel they can connect with? And Elaine's work, I think, that talks about memory is really important for this, because if I picked an obvious example, then a country house, which was constructed in the 18th or 19th century at home, may well have been funded by slave trade, because that was the nature of our economy. And for some people, the memories associated with that are quite trauma-informed. So I think the commonalities are about opening up the discussion and allowing people to have different interpretations and using that as a route to accessibility. And it may be physical accessibility, or it may be more intangible accessibility. I'm not sure whether I've answered your question, actually. So feel free to come back to me if that's not what you wanted.
So Cassandra, si tu veux revenir après avec une autre question, ça ira. Je voulais savoir, est-ce qu'il y a des questions dans la salle? Are there any people in the room who have comments or questions? We've sort of been banned so far from formulating those questions because of the priority given to those who are invisible. Are there any comments or questions at this point? No. If not, I will ask Lorraine has a follow-up question.
I'm full of questions, Linda. I was so interested in having you here just for the information of people in the room. I met Linda at a conference for Heritage in Winnipeg in 2018. And I saw right away the potential connection of what you're working on with what some of us here in Canada are working on. So I wonder, given what you know about Alain's work, I know you read his landmark study on vitality and heritage, which helped put it on the map for not just theory, but also policy, I think, maybe even law, who knows. I wonder if you have any initial thoughts on how what you've been developing might relate to minority communities, and particularly linguistic minority communities. If you've had any experience in that direction or some thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks. That's a very difficult question, actually. I really think that, my experience probably in terms of wellbeing and heritage at home isn't specifically about linguistic communities, but it's embedded in this idea of accessibility, because although obviously English is the dominant language in England, there are many, many languages obviously that are spoken, and many communities that don't have English as their first language. So I think there is a real issue in that accessibility point about having a more open and diverse approach to how things are communicated. And I think that is a language issue. It's probably slightly different here, but I think the Welsh situation is quite interesting in terms of comparison here because of the dual language within the country and a very strong sense of identity that's associated with the role of England in Welsh history, and then the role of Welsh in Welsh identity. So I think there are some parallels. I think the fundamental issue, though, is really about the concept of working in areas where we have not worked before. So we at work, I don't know how to express this. So we have an inclusion, diversity and equality strategy at home at Historic England. But I think my argument would be that if we worked with well-being, we would automatically deliver to inclusion, diversity and equality, because by using well-being inequality as our focus, we are reaching people who are probably in minority groups, whether that be linguistic minority or economic minority or any kind of educational context, or vulnerable in some way within the context of the dominant narrative. So I think the inequity argument is the one that feels like it relates for me, which is we can carry on working with the people that come to the room really easily, and there's nothing wrong with that. But actually, by deciding that that human-centered approach, that well-being approach, is a way to enact that human-centeredness, we're automatically saying we want to work in areas which isn't the dominant narrative. So I don't know whether that relates a little bit to what you're thinking.
We still have about 2 minutes. So if there is a last question from the chat, I don't see one. I guess I have a question following up on Linda's question, and I guess it's the question of how to, I guess, reconcile or interweave the individual and the collective, because you're talking a lot about individual well-being, and somehow it seems as though like through the individual one reaches the collective, but to what extent, talking about these questions of equality, for example, or inequality, to what extent are there strategies that are addressing groups or working with specific community groups to try to achieve, I guess, ultimately individual well-being, but also strengthen community-based organizations?
That's a really good question too, because I think that speaks to this idea of infrastructure, like community infrastructure and social infrastructure. So, I mean, there is arguably the kind of trickle-down effect of if you work with individual well-being, then one would like to think eventually it has a community impact. But I think you're right, there's a different thing, which is working with communities. I would say the strategic approach for us is about looking at what we would call anchor organizations, the community and voluntary organizations that exist in neighborhoods and local areas, and looking at who they work with. So for us, Age UK works with older people. They know their constituency, and they can work with a community that may be geographical, and or it may be about characteristics. And they are the ones that know what that landscape looks like. So I think the strategic response is that we work with those anchor organizations that have those connections to those communities. Because as a national body, we obviously can't be everywhere, but also we can't know what's really needed on the ground. And I think that link is really important. And actually your paper, Elaine, on vitality and memory mentions that idea about community infrastructure. And I think that's a really important one, because none of this is deliverable without that local network of community cultural organizations. And one of the big challenges at home through, I mentioned the National Academy of Social Prescribing, this concept of socially prescribing through a doctor, something which might previously have been medically identified, but a social solution to, say, loneliness or something, is that there's been a lot of tension about the fact that the health sector isn't funding the cultural organizations to deliver the local neighborhood engagement. And so that remains a kind of an interesting area, shall we say, about how and why that is supported and funded.